So just this week, both Portugal and Canada have said that they are reevaluating their plans to procure Lockheed Martin F-35s, in both cases citing concerns over U.S. foreign policy. Now, before diving into this, a couple things I want to make clear. First off, this is just talk at this point. It is not yet action. There's a big difference there. So we have to keep that in mind. Is this just a matter of these countries and maybe others in the future talking tough because they disagree with things the United States is doing? Or is this the start of a trend that could lead to something bigger that could be a pretty significant problem, all things considered? So please keep that in mind as we move through here. Starting with Portugal, they say they've been considering the F-35 to replace its aging fleet of F-16s. However, Defense Minister Nuno Melo, my apologies in the pronunciation, expressed reservations about this acquisition, attributing his concerns to recent shifts in U.S. foreign policy under President Donald Trump. Melo highlighted the unpredictable nature of the U.S. stance towards NATO and its allies, stating that such unpredictability necessitates a careful evaluation of defense procurement choices. He emphasized the importance of ally predictability in defense partnerships, suggesting that current U.S. policies could impact Portugal's decision. Again, if we're stepping back and really trying to look at this objectively, there is the possibility here that some of these countries are just not happy with policies under President Trump, and they're trying to find ways to signal that. Okay, so in this case, the F-35 fighter is widely accepted as the most capable and most advanced fifth-generation platform in the world today. However, there are other options, and it's not the craziest thing in the world that a country might decide against the F-35 in favor of something else if they think it is a better bet for their long-term national security. And one of the issues there that both of these countries cite is it possible that the United States at some point down the road, we might diverge on what we think is important, diverge on strategic priorities, and the U.S. might say, actually, we're not going to assist with this program, this F-35 program. We're not going to help with maintenance. We're not going to sell you additional parts that are needed to upkeep that fleet. That is the concern that Portugal and Canada are stating here. They say additionally, Melo raised apprehensions about potential U.S. restrictions on the maintenance and operational use of the F-35s. He pointed out that reliance on U.S. technology could lead to limitations in aircraft usage, maintenance, and component availability, especially if geopolitical dynamics shift unfavorably. Now, this is one where it's both hard to believe that happening, that the United States would shut off a close ally of access to weapons of war while they're actively in a conflict or trying to defend themselves. But at the same time, we saw something pretty similar with Ukraine with just the last week or so. Now, Ukraine is not NATO. We've not sold F-35s to Ukraine. So in a sense, it is apples and oranges. But I think that was kind of a mask-off moment for a lot of our allies, realizing, oh my God, in the middle of an existential war, the United States was willing to turn off arms shipments to have a point of leverage, if you will. And I think that's a driving concern, not just with Portugal and Canada, but with some other European nations as well. In fact, an article we talked about last 2 weeks ago, was that multiple European countries are trying to figure out ways to bring more defense manufacturing in-house. And we're seeing a big move by Germany right now to do just that, understandably so for a lot of reasons. In fact, this isn't something that's unique to all of these countries. It's something we do in the United States as well. We want to have as much control over our defense manufacturing and our defense sector as possible. It's a vulnerability if a single component is manufactured outside of your own territory. The minute a war starts up, you just don't know what you're going to have access to and what will be shut off. In most cases, we would assume that allies would continue to supply that equipment, but it is a variable, technically. Now, shifting over to Canada's concern, and this one is different because with Portugal, you're talking about a possible program, and they're essentially saying, hey, look, we're just going to look elsewhere. Maybe the F-35 isn't for us right now. Canada actually has a contract in place, so a bit different with how they're approaching it. They say Canada's plan to acquire 88 F-35s has also come under scrutiny. The Canadian public has shown significant opposition to the $19 billion deal, with many advocating for its cancellation. The sentiment is partly fueled by recent U.S. actions, including sanctions and territorial threats. Such developments have intensified calls within Canada to reassess the F-35 procurement, considering both financial implications and national security concerns. So things with Canada have been interesting lately, to say the least. We've got a series of economic sanctions being levied by the United States, current and coming into place in the near future. Some leadership in Canada has referred to it as economic warfare. So This is probably the most tense I've ever seen U.S.-Canadian relations in my life. On top of that, of course, the Trump administration has pretty regularly referred to the former Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau as the governor of Canada, regularly talked about Canada becoming the 51st U.S. state, despite a lot of objections inside of Canada. Right? Public sentiment in Canada is not in favor of that. In fact, I would argue what we're seeing in Canada right now, from an outsider looking in, is kind of a rise in Canadian nationalism. They see kind of a unified threat, if you will, pushing back against their country. And they, from everything I can see, are really kind of coming together. This pushback on the F-35 program appears to be a part of that. Again, this shouldn't be completely out of the blue. It's understandable where Canada is coming from on this front. Again, whether it's just talk and they're using this as another negotiating lever in what could be future sanctions packages, or what the economic picture looks like between the United States and Canada, that could be the case, or it could be a legitimate shift away from the United States long term. Again, these are both things we need to consider. Now, Canada has already put down money for its first 16 warplanes, which are due to be delivered early next year. And this is where the key difference sits between Portugal and Canada. Defense Minister Bill Blair of Canada is suggesting that the first F-35s might be accepted, and then the remainder of the fleet would be made up of aircraft from European suppliers, such as the Swedish-built Saab Gripen. Quoting Blair here, he said, quote, "The Prime Minister has asked me to go and examine those things in discussions with other sources, particularly where there may be opportunities to assemble those fighter jets in Canada." Now, when we're looking at the overall implications and the impact that these things might have, there's really three key areas I want to focus on. We've got economic, and then the near-term geopolitical fallout, and the kind of long-term strategic. The near-term economic is, of course, if you're looking at this, it's going to be a hit to Lockheed Martin and to the United States. There's a massive company with a ton of capital and a lot of profits. But if we're looking at the Portugal proposal that was estimated to be around $6 billion, and then Canada's $19 billion deal, there's not very many companies around the world that can just write off $25 million that they had planned on in the coming year or coming years. That's a significant program, right? On top of that, one of the reasons that the F-35 has been successful, and Ryan McBeth did a great video on this recently, is because we're selling it abroad to so many different allies, it drives down the cost per unit of this fighter jet, which is already silly expensive. But when we're able to sell to more allies, it makes everything along the line cheaper and cheaper. If this was just a U.S. program, it would be completely unsustainable. So what happens then to the overall financial health of the F-35 program if $25 billion is cut out of what was essentially a production schedule? They were on track, or at least 19 of that was on track to be built, right? That has some degree of impact. Maybe on the overall production of F-35s, maybe on Lockheed Martin specifically, the defense industry more broadly. We could see employment hits to Lockheed Martin. I don't know, right? But $25 billion is something that you have to take into consideration there. The second part is more near-term geopolitical, as we see multiple countries now, Canada, Portugal, and a couple countries across Europe saying we need to shift away from the United States because there's a concern in our defense sector that when the time comes, if we're too over-reliant on any country, in this case the United States, that could be a problem for our national security. And I think last week really highlighted this. It was kind of a mask-off moment for the United States and for the world, if you will, and maybe bringing us all to a realization where we should have been there earlier, and more on that in a second. But the United States, in trying to ramp up leverage on Ukraine to come to the negotiating table, turned off arms shipments to Ukraine in the middle of a war while Ukraine is actively fighting for their survival. And I think a lot of people around the world thought, that's not going to be a real thing. Yes, we might have disagreements with our allies, but in the middle of a conflict, there's no way that somebody would actually shut off access to a weapons program. Now, Ukraine is not in NATO, the very different ally than, you say, the United States and Canada, or even the United States and Portugal. But I think that was a shock to a lot in Europe and a lot of people around the world. So it probably brought us to this point where arguably we all should have been a while ago, which is, and to be fair, a lot of countries are considering this, which is every little aspect of your defense industry that cannot be manufactured entirely in-house is a vulnerability. No questions asked, right? Every piece, every aspect of maintenance, every piece of technology, every screw, nut, and bolt, every panel that you are not 100% in charge of in your own country could be shut off or hampered. The delivery could be hampered sometime in the future. And I think that's, just within the last week became much more present in the minds of defense and political leaders around the world. And the last piece here is more the strategic picture. Now, the United States exerts influence around the world in a lot of different ways. Of course, military, political, and economic are kind of the three primary we think about. The defense sector is tied right into the middle of that, right? The sale of F-35s, of course, it allows our allies to operate the fifth generation fighter. Just looking at this program, for instance, it's a big boom to the U.S. defense sector because they're selling these hyper expensive jets. And then it allows for a, closer cooperation in terms of national defense. When you've got two countries operating the same platforms, there's a lot more training they can do, a lot more interoperability when it comes to training exercises and or operational missions. So, this isn't just a matter of a single contract going by the wayside. This is a pretty critical component of the overall U.S. alliance structure around the world. That said, again, I want to just hammer home that right now it's not entirely clear. We don't know yet if this is just tough talk from our allies or actually concrete steps towards a longer term trend. So definitely worth keeping an eye on what happens in Portugal and Canada here in the next few weeks and months. And it seems like Europe is starting to make this trend as well. We'll see if there's any, again, actual action more than just words. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.